You're listening to a programme from BBC Radio 4. In this edition of File on 4, Jane Death investigates claims that last year's high-profile grooming case failed some of the victims.
For years, social services and police in Rochdale gave a child sex ring free rein to groom schoolgirls. Children who were being raped were judged to be making lifestyle choices. When 9 men were eventually convicted and sentenced to a total of 77 years, it was hailed as a success by Greater Manchester Police.
This has been a fantastic result for British justice. These victims have been through the most horrendous of crimes, and I just want to commend their bravery.
But tonight a former detective says she's ashamed of her part in an investigation which failed victims and failed to put paedophiles before the court.
Evidence has been shut out of this case. Had the full facts been heard from the girls that I dealt with, we would have got heavier sentences. There wouldn't now be offenders still walking the streets of Rochdale.
Now turned whistleblower, she tells us why she felt she had to leave the force and go public.
It is horrendous what these kids go through. The very fact that they come out at the end of it prepared to put their trust in us again to get these men put away and then are let down again, that fills me with horror, and I'm disgusted and ashamed of my part in that process.
The Director of Public Prosecution says police and lawyers are being too cautious when it comes to prosecuting people for child sex abuse. He's threatening to re-examine hundreds of cases. Should Rochdale be one of them?
We ended up in the back of a takeaway, and after a couple of times of going, they just started to wean you into different things every time you went, and like that, if you know what I mean, sex. And then after a couple of months, we went into different houses and different takeaways and different cars. It expanded, every weekend there was somebody different. But once you're too far in to get back out.
Yeah, once one guy had your number, then they'd pass it around like a ball. Like when you're playing catch, that's how so many people got involved because the number would just get passed around.
Tessa is 20 now, Chelsea 17. We've changed their names to protect their identities. When they were 14 and 12, what started as getting free kebabs off the men running takeaways in town turned into being forced to have sex with them. They weren't the only girls, and there was a whole network of men, most of them in the takeaway business or driving taxis. They controlled their victims by threatening to kill them and their families, and by getting them off their heads on vodka. Chelsea got pregnant by one of the men. She had an abortion.
Some of the guys was horrible. And actual horrible. They'd just be nasty. And some guys, you take you to some flat, and then the actual guy who owned the flat would be nasty. It was just horrible.
I wanted to see some of the places where this went on. Here on the Phalange estate was one of the flats the girls were taken to. The front doors here are half hidden behind balcony walls, and it's weirdly quiet. I've hardly seen anyone. It would have been easy to smuggle girls in and out. Chelsea said she was taken here on her own, and in the front room the men would be sitting in a circle. She was passed around the circle, going into the bedroom to have sex with one after the other. There was a piece of paper stuck on the door, a kind of tab, where the men wrote down how much they owed. The abuse could have been stopped. 5 years ago, another girl smashed up a kebab house. When she was arrested, she poured out everything to police. Her father assumed men would be prosecuted.
At first, the evidence really was gathered around 2 men, and basically it was treated as a one-off rape. I know evidence was gathered from one of the takeaways, mattresses and things like that, from my daughter's knickers. If you've got the DNA evidence, how can this not proceed?
The police passed a file to the Crown Prosecution Service, where it was looked at by 2 lawyers.
6 months later, I think it was 5-6 months later, I just received a letter from the Crown Prosecution Service informing us that there wasn't a reliable prospect of prosecution or conviction, and therefore the case was dropped. My overall impression was that the police were trying their best, but it seemed like their hands were tied. As soon as I read the letter, I screwed it up in a ball and threw it in the dustbin. So much anger, and I just thought, well, fantastic, Justice Rochdale, fantastic. And it's transpired that the CPS made the decision that my daughter wouldn't have been a credible witness.
Within a week, his daughter was back in the grip of her abusers, being raped by up to 5 men a night. She only escaped when she got pregnant and stopped being of use. She would eventually become Girl A, the main witness at the trial. Tessa was also arrested. At 15, she was put in a police cell and questioned, along the lines of being some kind of pimp, recruiting her friends to be raped. She denies that, and the police didn't charge her. But Tessa's mother says nor did they investigate the men.
Tessa gave them a list of names, phone numbers, taxis they drove. There must have been about 2 pages of A4, and nothing was done with none of it. I used to go to case conferences and I ask them why these people are still riding around in Rochdale taxis, taking young girls to school, when you know that they've been doing things to my daughter. I can't tell you how bad the feelings are. It's horrendous.
By the time officers finally went after the men, police themselves think they'd abused 47 girls. When the whole awful story came out, it couldn't have looked worse for the council and Greater Manchester Police. Operation Span was launched, a new investigation into child grooming which, it was promised, would put right the wrongs of the first inquiry, which had let the girls down 2 years before. But hardly any of the victims were prepared to go near the police. That's where Detective Constable Margaret Oliver comes into the story.
Right, these are a selection of the commendations that I've received in my time working for Greater Manchester Police. This was, what's this one? Oh yeah, that was another commendation I got. A guy was kidnapped and I was involved in apprehending that offender.
Margaret Oliver's first beat when she joined the ranks was Moss Side, at the time notorious for murders and gun crime. Now, she's no soft touch, but what she has is the common touch. People who hate the police would talk to Maggie. She became a detective. She worked as a family liaison officer and in witness protection on some of Manchester's biggest murder trials. Her reputation for dealing with reluctant, frightened witnesses was the reason officers on Operation Span wanted her. She was asked to get Chelsea on board. She was also told to get Tessa ready for a trial, if she could get her family to trust the police after everything that had gone on with the arrest.
I picked the phone up and it was somebody who was working on what became Span. So I went over and the conversation was that we're starting this job. We are going to try to put right the wrongs of 2008. It's being dealt with at the very highest level. We're in consultation with the CPS, with the Home Office. It was recognised that the original Rochdale job had been a disaster and we were there to put it right.
And what did they tell you they wanted you to help with?
What I was told was that at the centre of this whole investigation was a family that, in the words of all the policy documents, were critical for the successful development of this investigation, but that they were very hostile, having been let down repeatedly by the authorities. What was also told to me at the time was that the child, in the original 2008 inquiry, had been arrested. There was a suggestion that she had been involved in recruiting other children for these men and interviewed as a suspect. But there was universal horror and disgust that that had happened.
Margaret Oliver told her bosses she wanted nothing to do with Operation Span if history was going to repeat itself. She was assured this time it would be different.
I've had sight of police documents from January 2011. They're from the discussions of the major incident team, and they lay out how the police and Crown Prosecution Service viewed Tessa. The papers say, quote, "She is clearly a victim of sexual abuse and grooming." They say Tessa was used to supply child victims, but that everything should be done professionally to help her recognise she really is a victim of the corrupting influence of older men. It says, quote, "Were she to become a Crown witness, there's little doubt her evidence would be both vital and compelling." Margaret Oliver says a month later, the police and Crown Prosecution Service made a decision. Tessa was needed as a witness. That decision was put down in writing by the CPS. Margaret Oliver says she'd never known that happened before on a case. What she had to do now was show Tessa's family the police were serious. Your first meeting with the family, how did that go?
This was 5 years after the abuse. They were trying to move on with their lives. When I first turned up at their door, they didn't want to speak to me. And you know what? I understand that. I would be angry and I would be very mistrusting of any authority who came through my door. So now here I am again asking them, look, I assure you that this time we really mean business. We are going to look after you. Understandably, they were, distant, hostile, mistrusting, and actually testing the water a lot.
She come to the house the first time and I said, no, I don't want to do no statements, because I just thought it's going to make more trouble, blah, blah, blah. And then after a bit, and then my mum started speaking to her, and so then I just thought to myself, well, it can't be doing that much harm. So then I thought, well, I'll do some statements. The trust started just coming more stronger and stronger, and then I thought, well, let's get the men off the street, and it'd be better for people out there now and young girls, because I know how easy it is just to get trapped into it. It's very easy to get trapped.
And so began an intense process, Tessa gradually letting Margaret Oliver in on the abuse she'd suffered.
The first interview was very disjointed. There wasn't a great deal revealed in terms of evidence. By the time we did the second interview, things were very different, and she began to disclose real detail of the men that had abused her. She talked of having felt dirty and about the fact that there was drink always involved.
Was it a relief to her to talk to you about this or not?
I think it was the start of her journey back. She agreed to take me around locations and show me which locations were being used by these men. I remember vividly one of the locations that she spoke about. She'd got the name mixed up, and we spent quite a considerable amount of time driving up and down this remote road until she recognised a garage, a petrol station. Bear in mind that on the majority of the occasions when the abuse took place, she was drunk. But she spotted a petrol station, and from there we followed a road and we found this really remote area which to me looked like it was on the moors, where she said that the taxi drivers would take her and other victims and have sex with them. By pointing out these premises and locations, that is vividly bringing back to her the detail of the abuse that happened in that place. It was undoubtedly traumatic.
Imagine having to come back somewhere like this, a flat above a shop near the station, where you'd been taken through big metal gates which had been padlocked behind you. When Tessa was talking about the man who brought her here, she said, "He locked every door behind us, every single door. I thought he was going to keep us locked up and not let us out."
In the end, there were so many flats, car parks and lay-bys they didn't get through them all, but Tessa had given Margaret Oliver information about 20 men. The next step was asking her to identify them from photographs.
She was distraught through that. I do know it was one of the most difficult parts of the whole process. Halfway through, she came out. She was crying. She came out for a cigarette. She didn't know whether she could go back in. It was very, very upsetting for her.
Margaret Oliver was under pressure too. There were daily briefings ramming home how important it was the girls cooperated. But then something seemed to change. DC Oliver wasn't in the loop, but she sensed a shift in atmosphere.
There was a barristers' meeting. That was the day that the barrister who had been allocated to this job first came to discuss the job. That meeting finished at 4 o'clock that Friday afternoon. The bosses came out of that meeting and I was told actually by another officer who had been in there, that they were no longer intending to use the older girl.
Your reaction?
Horror and anger and disgust. I remember one of the senior officers basically told me to calm down, just calm down. What you've got to realise is that this is all a game. We have to present the evidence in the best way we can. And I said, a game? And I was just in complete and utter shock. But then I was told, well, no, we still want to use the younger girl. And I said, I am not using anybody. And I just picked my bags up and I left.
So why was Tessa ditched? I've seen another police document which reveals something about the joint thinking of the police and Crown Prosecution Service. It says Tessa, quote, did not see herself as a victim and had entered into relationships, in inverted commas, of her own accord. It goes on, how could we say all our witnesses were telling the truth, yet they contradicted each other? And in a startling difference to the major incident team document, which stated Tessa was a victim and a vital and compelling one, now the official line is, there is little evidence that Tessa had been a victim prior to her being 16 years of age. Remember girl A? Remember how in 2008 police and social services dismissed her as making a lifestyle choice? Now here Tessa is, being seen as having consented. Margaret Oliver says it was history repeating itself and it filled her with horror. But while girl A was supported in the trial last year, Tessa was demonised. Because although the police and CPS didn't want her in front of the jury, they still wanted to use some of her evidence. So, without telling her, they added her to the indictment, alongside the names of the accused men. Tessa had never been charged, completely denies being part of the conspiracy, but she hasn't been able to defend herself against the picture painted of her in court. The police told Tessa she was a victim. The legal system had her down as a pimp.
When we actually started doing the statements, they led me on to be a victim, and then just found out that I actually wasn't being treated like a victim. I was on a charge sheet, which I really am annoyed about, because he could have told me and I could have got a barrister and fighted my corner. Why didn't they tell me? Because I'm innocent until proven guilty. I don't think that they should keep anything from anybody. They should tell them what they're doing behind the back.
We wanted to interview someone at the CPS to ask them about their decision on Tessa, but they sent us a statement instead.
Although this young woman was named as part of the conspiracy on the indictment in this case, the CPS advised that she should be treated as a victim first and foremost, and she was treated as such throughout. As is often necessary in large or complex trials, we focus the prosecution case on a selection of victims whose evidence reflects the overall criminality against each identified suspect, and who would give the best evidence in court. The full criminality alleged was reflected in the charges put before the court.
Margaret Oliver says she's ashamed of her part in a process that won Tessa's trust only to betray her. She knows she'll be accused of having got too emotionally involved. You have worked on some of the biggest cases in Greater Manchester.
Yes,
you'll have seen big trials at court.
Absolutely.
You will know that not everyone that is interviewed actually makes it to court.
No.
Not every crime that is investigated is put before the jury. The legal process needs to kind of refine and edit what it puts to the jury, because sometimes that's how convictions are got. You understand that, don't you?
I do understand it, yeah. But what I would say on this is that the evidence had been reviewed by the most experienced CPS and police officers 4 or 5 months before we started the process of engaging these children. When the police service goes to a vulnerable victim and says, we need you, trust us, does that then give us the right 5-6 months later to change our mind? She has to this day never had a face-to-face explanation. And you know what, when somebody says to me, well, not everybody gets their day in court. Well, you know what? Don't go near them in the first place.
Greater Manchester is the second biggest police force in England and Wales after the Met, used to complex investigations and high-profile trials. I asked Chief Constable Sir Peter Fahey how it can be that a woman defined by the police as a victim and a critical witness is suddenly told thanks, but we've changed our minds.
Well, I would say that sadly that will occur because while somebody may have been identified as a victim and why an individual police officer may have formed a particular view about a victim, when you then take it into the investigation process, the decision-making of the Crown Prosecution Service, a totally different set of criteria is then involved. And that is why you have got to be very, very careful as an investigator or as a police officer in terms of what you tell a victim, what you promise to a victim, because ultimately that is not your decision. There are really difficult factors that prosecutors have to juggle in what they're going to charge, where you actually draw the line as to which victims are in that particular trial process and which are not. And I'm not in any way seeking to criticise the Crown Prosecution Service because I think these are really difficult judgments they have to make.
We've seen some police documents that say that the reason that this particular girl was dropped was because it was deemed she had entered into relationships of her own accord and there was little evidence she was a victim. Isn't that exactly the kind of perverse judgment made of girl A right back in 2008, a judgment that we look at with horror now?
No, I don't really accept that. I think overall we knew in a lot of the cases of these victims that when you looked at it initially, obviously they had consented to the relationship. And you have to be honest with victims and you have to be realistic that when you go into the court process, these are exactly the sort of questions that will be asked by the defence, the sort of pressure that young people are going to be put under. And I think that is the centre of this issue.
You had an absolute expert in that area, Margaret Oliver, but she's left in disgust because she felt that through you she'd betrayed some very vulnerable people and that she'd been left feeling that the police had used that family. Isn't it right that you need exactly the kind of people like Margaret Oliver?
Well, I've got lots and lots of officers who are extremely dedicated working on this in these really demanding situations. We've put a lot of work into this officer. We've spoken to her a lot, trying to deal with the issues which she has raised. But as I come back to it, it is really important that any investigator maintains their objectivity.
The Home Affairs Committee of MPs has been hearing evidence on child grooming, including the Rochdale case. Chairman Keith Vaz says the concerns Margaret Oliver's raised about Operation Span can't be blamed on this system.
I'm astonished that a serving officer of Greater Manchester would feel that the only way to draw attention to the lack of process is to leave the force. I'm disappointed that more effective action was not taken. It's important that when we have this kind of information that people ought to be prosecuted, and the system should not be used as an excuse for not ensuring that those who are guilty of abuse are brought to justice. We certainly would like to hear more from Greater Manchester Police as a result of what has been said by this whistleblower. We can't let it just ride. We really do need to know what the facts are.
In the end, only Chelsea was used as a witness in court, and only in relation to one charge of trafficking for sexual exploitation against one man. She and 4 other girls did help convict 9 men. The police said their evidence had secured justice.
9 men have been convicted of being part of a child sexual exploitation ring in Greater Manchester. The court heard that
these victims have been through the most horrendous of crimes, and I just want to commend their bravery in relation to the ordeal they've had to go through. In relation to the offenders, I condemn them from the highest level.
But Margaret Oliver says Chelsea and Tessa named many more men than were in the dock. Between them they named 20 men, some that went to court, some that didn't.
I mentioned loads of people and only one got charged. It makes me mad that these guys have not been charged, but I mentioned still working around Rochdale. It just gets me so angry and they don't talk to me, they just walk past. We don't make eye contact and we don't speak, we just pretend that we haven't seen each other.
And File on 4 has learned that girl A, the police's key witness in court, also fears men she named haven't been pursued. The Chief Constable himself has admitted there are 20 to 30 suspects who've never been charged. Girl A's father says he's proud of what his daughter did in court, and the trial did go some way towards justice, but it just feels like now the police have got some convictions, The investigation's running out of steam.
We were under the impression that trial would follow trial, which would follow trial, and these men would be put away. I know my daughter was invited to the police station to do a couple more identifications, which she did, but we've not heard anything else about them whatsoever. I can go out into Rochdale town centre and I can be stood in a queue in a shop, and I can look at a chap behind me and I can think, have you raped my daughter? How would you like to live with that? It's a horrible feeling.
Greater Manchester Police's new investigation into the wider circle of paedophiles is called Operation Doublet. It initially approached 42 potential victims. 6 are working with police, but the rest don't want to make a criminal complaint. Well, why not? Rochdale's MP Simon Danchuk says the police aren't handling it right. He, like us, has been contacted by sources close to the investigation who say Greater Manchester Police don't have the skills to reassure victims and really root out grooming.
There are whistleblowers that have come to me that have made it quite clear that they don't believe all the victims are being assisted to come forward as witnesses to prosecute cases. And it's been made clear that Greater Manchester Police have been saying to some victims, you need to make a decision as to whether you want to help us prosecute a case or not by a certain date. Now, one of the problems with that, for anybody who has any insight into this subject, you can't put a deadline on when a victim of child sex abuse should come forward or decide when they feel comfortable about, assisting and prosecuting. So that's just one example where I think Greater Manchester Police are getting it wrong.
Isn't now the time to just let social services, the police, the CPS get on with doing a better job? Won't that be what keeps children safe?
I think there were failings in terms of Operation Span, and what it tells us now is that there is a window of opportunity for Greater Manchester Police, but that window of opportunity is closing very quickly because victims aren't being supported properly, and as time goes on, as weeks and months go on, it is less likely that they're going to cooperate and more likely that abusers, the perpetrators of these horrific crimes, will continue to walk the streets of Rochdale and beyond.
Greater Manchester Police say they would never impose a deadline for supporting a prosecution. Investigations run at the victim's pace. But if new victims come forward in relation to someone already charged and due in court, there can be tighter timescales. Chief Constable Sir Peter Fahey says the force is committed to finding the as many as 30 men still grooming girls, and denies there's any attempt to hurry victims or limit cases.
We absolutely are encouraging working with all the agencies in terms of identifying victims, bringing young people forward who are vulnerable, helping those even when we can't get it into a court case. I've been very, very open to say, yes, absolutely, this could happen again. Why? Because the two factors you need, vulnerable young people and people being prepared to abuse, are still very much there. This is a constant challenge that we have, and absolutely we believe there are a number of men in the Rochdale area that we believe continue to try and groom and to try and abuse young people, and that is why we are using a range of tactics to disrupt their activities.
The young woman who was really key to the trial and its success, Girl A, her father says that she tried to give the police more names after that trial had finished, and 8 months later no one has picked up the phone to find out any more.
I'm quite happy to go back to that particular parent and check that out. I know that there are a number of young girls that we are investigating, and our concern and our regret is a number of those at the moment do not feel prepared to come forward. There are other people out there today who are grooming, other people are abusing, and undoubtedly will get away with it because of the real complexities of these type of investigations.
So the Chief Constable says the investigation which came out of Operation Span is very much ongoing. Has Margaret Oliver got things out of proportion?
If you stand back a bit and look at the wider picture, a child sex ring was broken up, men were put away, children were heard, the streets of Rochdale are safer than they were.
I would say, number one, it's the tip of the iceberg, and I feel that had the full facts been heard from the girls that I dealt with, we would have got heavier sentences. Number two, there wouldn't now be offenders still walking the streets of Rochdale. And number three, I feel that we need to completely overhaul the way we deal with this kind of crime.
The Chief Prosecutor for England and Wales, Keir Starmer, has come to the same conclusion. This month he said he's issuing new guidelines for police and prosecutors because they're being overly cautious in child abuse cases. He told the Today programme people have been worrying too much about the credibility of the accusers instead of the accused.
We have reached a watershed moment. Many victims still don't have confidence to come forward, and they don't have confidence in the criminal justice system. So I don't think we can go on like this.
Hundreds of cases where there have been no prosecutions are going to be re-examined. The Rochdale trial was held up as a watershed, a turning point in the way we investigate child sexual exploitation. But given what Margaret Oliver believes about past mistakes being repeated, and other whistleblowers saying they're worried about current investigations, have we really moved on, or are we stuck in the same old way of doing things? Chief Constable Sir Peter Fahey himself is arguing for something radical to change.
We've obviously got a better working relationship with the Crown Prosecution Service. We've learnt a lot in terms of our working with social services. But at the end of the day, in this type of offence, it requires enormously on the victim, in a way that, for instance, if you're a victim of burglary, nobody blames you for leaving the front door unlocked. But in these sorts of cases, any weakness of character, previous convictions, inconsistencies in the story, whether they initially encouraged or discouraged the attention, all those issues are gone over in huge depth. And that is why it makes these sorts of cases so difficult. There needs to be a fundamental review of the way that victims of these sorts of offences are dealt with in the system, and perhaps we need special courts because of the huge pressure that giving evidence in this way puts on victims.
No wonder so few victims want to go through with a trial. But if they do, the ordeal doesn't end when the jury delivers its verdict and everyone drifts away from the court steps. That's when the victims are left trying to rebuild their lives. The police have to pull out and leave it to someone else to make sure victims are okay. But the families we've spoken to say no one else has made sure, and they're not okay. Girl A's father says they haven't had the help they really need.
There is no support there. It's over, it's done with. That seems to be the general consensus as far as all frontline services are concerned. You've done your job, everything's over, move on. But you need help to move on. And the fact that there is a lack of support, it does make things hard. Hopefully, time will heal. I don't know. I think the police at one time offered her some counselling, which she went to a couple of times. But I think she needed more counselling. Certainly Rochdale Social Services should offer to pay for counselling for my daughter. I don't think that would be a bad thing at all, to help her get back on track.
Tessa and Chelsea didn't get counselling either. Life's pretty lonely. They weren't allowed to be around their friends' kids. They believe they're being punished because they admitted having been groomed. Some of the Rochdale victims are suing the council for failing in its responsibility towards them. Richard Scorer is their solicitor.
These young women came to me very soon after the end of the trial. Like many survivors of abuse, they are very vulnerable young women. But my real sense was just how utterly emotionally and psychologically drained and exhausted they were by the whole process. It was hugely, hugely stressful, and, that's the context in which they need the aftercare support to rebuild their lives.
What form does that support need to take?
This is the most appalling and severe kind of abuse and assault, so it produces the most appalling and severe psychological consequences, and this is real post-traumatic stress disorder of the most extreme kind, the flashbacks, the nightmares, the constant reliving of these experiences. If you go on an NHS waiting list, you might eventually get to see a counsellor, but there's no guarantee that that person will have any specialist training in treating survivors of abuse. They also need to get back the lost years of education, because many of them have lost out on that as a result of these experiences. And that just isn't available unless they have the money to pay for it. There's no sign from anything we've seen that Rochdale Council or any of the other agencies involved are setting out to provide additional support or aftercare. So the only way that we can enable these young people to rebuild their lives is to look at the possibility of compensation through the civil court system.
In response, Rochdale Council says in the last year it has started offering help to victims of sexual exploitation. In a statement they told us,
"If any young person feels they've not received the level of support they have a right to expect from this council, we would urge them to get in touch with us. Working with our local partners, we've put in place a range of new support mechanisms. These include counselling, weekly mentoring training, accommodation, help with finding work or training, and many other forms of support a person may require. Our Chief Executive and Director of Children's Services have also met some victims and their families. They would be more than willing to meet anyone else who wishes to share their concerns."
The men who groomed girls in Rochdale ruined lives. A trial was never going to repair that damage. But it did offer the chance to try to restore faith in some things, in the police, in justice. Yet Margaret Oliver says instead Tessa and Chelsea were exploited all over again, first by the men that groomed them, and then by a flawed police investigation. Her principles have cost her a career she loved. Tessa and Chelsea still have to see some of the men they say abused them. But they'd rather live with that than risk helping the police again.
I feel like a big burden just still hanging over me. Now we're in 2013. It's just led to so much rubbish that I just wish I never even did it.
I think if I could turn back time now, I wouldn't have done the court case. Never. If a girl come to me now, I'd say, don't do it, because in the long run it's horrible.
I can't even begin to understand how these children feel, having been let down time and time and time again, after having tried to assist in putting these men away. That goes against everything that I as a police officer joined to do, and that's why I've walked away.